Hi everybody in abnormal psychology class. If we were in class today, it's start all over again. Take 4. It's my daughter distracting me. Hi everybody. If we were in class today, I'm recording this on April 1st. Yes, it's April Fool's Day, but this is no joke that we would be covering 3 relatively short chapters on what used to be known as habit disorders. That is 3 separate topics now within the DSM-5 and 3 separate chapters. So the first one we're going to go over is chapter 9, feeding and eating disorders. I'm only going to give you the basics for what you need to know for the exam, even though there is plenty more to read and learn about. So in the book, if you're following along, page 276 and 277. The first condition is anorexia. You've probably heard of this, but maybe you don't know the specific details. What I want you to know, I'm going to cheat and look at my notes here, specifically is this. Anorexia is severely limiting your food intake. It's not possible for a person to go without food. That person would die of starvation. So instead, he or she severely limits what they eat. Second of all, an extreme concern about gaining weight. It's a good idea to care about your health, but I mean, this goes to an extreme when someone has anorexia. It is on their mind all the time. Third thing is an extreme fear about becoming obese and overweight, and what will people think, and what will I think of myself? And the fourth symptom is a grossly distorted sense of appearance. So no matter how much weight you lose, you don't understand that you are too thin, and that does not look good. So not understanding one's appearance is another problem. Anorexia. They used to say that it has to be a specific amount of weight loss or a specific percentage under what you should weigh. They've done away with that requirement. It's now basically a cognitive thing existing in your mind of how you perceive yourself, and then a behavioral thing of the actions you take because of that. So when you think about it, it could be argued this is like an obsessive compulsive condition, because it really is. Okay. One thing that is going to be on the exam is the mortality rate. The death rate for anorexia is 6 times what it would normally be for a person in that age range. So we're usually talking about adolescents, teens, and young adults. 6 times higher for people who have anorexia. Moving right along, the next condition is bulimia. Bulimia is a pattern typically of binging and purging. Instead of eating barely enough to stay healthy and well, that's anorexia. Bulimia is a condition where people eat too much, and not usually celery and carrot sticks. It's usually bad food, junk food, fats, sugars, carbs, and then you feel guilty about it and you need to get rid of it. I don't mean to gross you out, but there's really 2 ends of the body it can come out of. You either force yourself to throw up or force yourself to go to the bathroom to get rid of it. However, there's an unusual kind of bulimia where people exercise excessively. You could do this in addition to throwing up or going to the bathroom, or it could be instead of. So, people with bulimia, again, I'm cheating and looking at my notes here, do not usually have a distorted sense of their appearance. They usually understand quite well the way they look, but they're still obsessed with it anyway. So if you ask somebody with anorexia who might be 30, 40, or 50 pounds underweight, they still say, well, I'm fat, and you can't convince me otherwise. But people with bulimia, it's very different because they know how they look, but they still get obsessed with food and other things related to their appearance. So it is quite different. Okay, next chapter. That was on page 281, by the way, bulimia. And it continues on to page 282 with some stories that follow. Now we're ready to move on to the next chapter. That's all you need to know for chapter 9, elimination disorders. And yes, I'm talking about going to the bathroom. I'm allowed to say that in this class. That's the kind of disorders we're talking about in chapter 10. So first we have enuresis. This starts on page 293. Peeing in your pants, peeing in the bed, at times when it's not appropriate to do that. And what I mean by that is it's an age-related thing. We would not diagnose this in a 2-year-old or even a 3-year-old. But if you're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, yes, you should know how to use the bathroom by now. So enuresis refers to urinating. It kind of sounds like that. Enuresis, urinating. But encopresis refers to, well, can I say this? Pooping in your pants. People do that. Kids do that. The older you get, the more people tend to grow out of this. So that is what makes enuresis and encopresis different. Is it a bowel problem? Encopresis. Is it a urination problem? Enuresis. Now, a couple of things I want you to know for the exam. First of all, this is much more of a boy thing than a girl thing. Both of these conditions, but especially enuresis. In chapter 9, you probably guessed that eating disorders are much more of a female thing. In fact, it's over 95%. I've heard 96 or 97%, but still, that is astronomical, the difference between males and females. Yet in this chapter, chapter 10, this is more of a boy thing, especially enuresis. We don't diagnose it until the child is old enough to know better and to know how and when to use the bathroom. Now, here's a couple of things to know. Why would a kid get enuresis? Maybe he or she is already potty trained and all of a sudden they start peeing in the bed or peeing in the pants. It's often because of the birth of a new sibling. That is the #1 reason. Mom has another baby. Without realizing it, you want to act like a baby. And so you start doing those things, especially enuresis for little boys who were potty trained. That is quite common. By the way, a lesser known type of enuresis is called primary, and that means that you were never potty trained in the first place. If a kid had that, I would want to know if there's any medical problems. But if he was potty trained and then lost that ability to use the bathroom as needed, I would ask, did mom just have a new baby? That's the typical reason. Not always, but quite often. Encopresis, that is often a medical issue. If the kid is being honest with you about why all of a sudden he's pooping in his pants or in his bed, often it hurts. And the kid may not admit that until you ask the right questions. So that is often the reason why encopresis exists. By the way, typically we wait for the age of 5. We don't usually diagnose it, either of those conditions I should say, until the age of 5. But again, far more common in boys, especially enuresis. Encopresis, uncomfortable bowel movements, going to the bathroom, pooping, yeah, I'm allowed to say that, is uncomfortable and even painful. So, moving right along, you can find that on page 294 and 295. We are now ready to talk about sleep disorders, or as chapter 11 calls it, sleep-wake disorders. I'm going to tell you only what you need to know. You're welcome. If we were in class, we would go into far more detail. First thing, it's rather difficult to diagnose a sleep disorder because your doctor or psychologist is not sleeping next to you. They kind of have to depend on you telling him or her what's really going on. Also, sleep changes throughout the lifespan. One person's sleep is not what the other person does, you know, waking up at night, going to bed late, getting up early, whatever. So it does make it a little challenging to get a really accurate read on what's going on with someone. Just so you know, what's normal for one person might not be normal for another person. That's important to know. So, moving right along. insomnia or insomnia disorder. This is on page 299, but it goes on for a few pages after that. What I want you to know is this is one of the few disorders, rather than just saying maladaptive, we also look at the factor, is the person in any distress? Does the person come to the professional, doctor or psychologist, and say, yes, I'm having this problem? So here's what you want to know. 3 kinds of insomnia. Inability to fall asleep. Do you just lay in bed at night and you can't fall asleep? That's one type of insomnia. Waking up too early. You do fall asleep okay, but then you wake up much earlier than you need to. And the third kind is waking up too much at night. It's normal to wake up maybe once, but it happens several times a night. That would be a problem, and that really shows that your sleep is very disruptive. So 3 kinds of anorexia. And we do wait for the person to say, yes, I'm in some distress about this. This is a problem for me. So we want to see if that is a pattern, first of all, that the person feels distressed about. Now, next thing, insomnia is a lack of sleep, but hypersomnia is too much sleep. Even when you wake up after 10, 12, or 14 hours, you still feel tired. Page 309 and 310 in your book, hypersomnia. What I want you to know is there's first of all, this is unusual, but a very unusual type of hypersomnia is called Klein-Levin syndrome. Klein-Levin syndrome occurs when a person barely wakes up, maybe to go to the bathroom and eat, but that's it. Basically, you're like a hibernating bear, sleeping pretty much 24 hours a day, with a few exceptions for eating and going to the bathroom. Obviously, that would be very disruptive for school, work, and pretty much anything else that you need to do. Klein-Levin syndrome. That's under the topic of sleep-wake disorders, where it talks about hypersomnia on 309 and 310. Moving right along. Next thing I want you to know is narcolepsy. 313, 314, and 315. A typical sleep cycle from being awake to dreaming is 90 minutes. Every person's different, of course. Can you imagine that happening in less than 2 minutes, or even in the matter of a couple of seconds? You're wide awake and you're dreaming? Well, that is narcolepsy. So that is very debilitating. If you're driving a car, can you imagine you go from being wide awake to being fast asleep and dreaming? This is a very debilitating condition for people who have it. But good news for us old people. Are you over 30? Most of you aren't. But for those of us who are, it's rare to start getting narcolepsy after you're 30. It's possible, it's just unusual. Narcolepsy. Next condition I want you to know, if you're following along in the book, is apnea. This is on page 318 to 320. Apnea, you stop breathing. Not enough to the point where it's fatal. That's possible but rare. What happens instead is you wake up because you feel like you can't breathe. You're gagging for air, you're gasping for air, you're panting, you're breathing heavily, and now you're awake. If that happens only once or twice a year, maybe not a big deal. Can you imagine it happening several times per night? That would be very disruptive. Apnea. I want you to know that anybody can get apnea. Anybody. But the most common pattern is males more than females. Middle-aged people, somewhere around 40 to 60 years old, and overweight and smokers. So if somebody has all 4 of those things, they are very much at risk for apnea. An overweight male smoker who's a middle-aged person. Yeah, that's not a good recipe for success with one's health, but especially when it comes to apnea. Next thing I want you to know, circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders. That sounds like a lot to say, but it's really pretty simple. Your sleep schedule is all out of whack. It could be a brain chemistry problem, but it could also be a lifestyle habit kind of thing also. Do you stay up too late? Is it hard to wake up in the morning? Does it have something to do with your job? Does it have something to do with traveling? The baby keeps you up at night, the neighbor's loud music. It could be a lot of reasons. But what I want you to know for the exam are two things. One, shift work. People who have jobs and their shift changes constantly, they struggle with circadian rhythm sleep disorders quite often. If you can get on a regular shift, that's great. If your shift doesn't change much, that's even better. It's still hard to get used to changing job shifts. And the other thing is jet lag. When people travel, I don't just mean to Vegas or LA, that's only one time zone from Arizona. I mean across the country or across the world. It is hard to get your brain used to it, and you could easily develop this condition. Now, the one thing that I want you to know, if you travel from the west to the east, you develop more of this circadian rhythm problem than if you go from east to west. Instead of trying to memorize that, try to understand. If you were to go from Phoenix to Miami, great, I get to play on the beach if it's nice weather and good conditions. But they're 3 hours ahead of us, so you've lost 3 hours. If you're going there for something like a meeting, that's happened to me. If I have to be at an 8 o'clock meeting the next day, that's 5 a.m. Arizona time. But if I got to go from east in a western direction, like perhaps Honolulu, that's 3 time zones to the west, great, another beach, I might be thinking. But if I have a meeting to go to at 8 a.m., that's 11 a.m. Arizona time. So therefore, I've gained 3 hours in my day. It will not be as hard to get used to as the other example that I gave. If any of you are football fans, our Arizona Cardinals haven't been doing so great lately, but I remember a few years ago, they had back-to-back games in Detroit and Pittsburgh. They decided to stay rather than perhaps flying back here on Monday morning and then Friday or Saturday back to the same part of the country. They knew this stuff and they thought, you know what, traveling to the east twice within a week is not a good idea. It really does mess with your circadian rhythms. So therefore, knowing that is important. When you travel toward the east, it is the most jet lag. That's page 323 to 325. The last thing is one that I bet a lot of people can relate to because it is just so common. Restless leg syndrome. It is a psychological disorder, and it is the last one that we will talk about, not only for this chapter, but for this exam. Page 336 and 337. Restless leg syndrome. If you know anybody who has this, they don't usually describe it as painful. They usually describe it as uncomfortable, like pins and needles. And therefore, when you're sedentary, sitting too long or laying down too long, you, well, shake your legs, just like it sounds. Restless leg syndrome. So it's not usually deadly or even dangerous. It's more uncomfortable than anything else. The sensation of what people say, pins and needles, probably from your knees, typically down to your ankles, not so painful as uncomfortable. Restless leg syndrome. So, last thing on this recording, there is an exam that is open for you, open book, open note. You can even call or text me. I can't give you answers, but I can explain things so that you'll be ready for this exam. And that is on the syllabus, and it would be starting April 1st, but since we're all online, you can do this anytime you want with the password that we are now using, unexpected. So good luck with everything, and let me know what I can do to help. Until next time, see you then.